For years, the board of directors, the institutional shareholders, and every senior executive inside the company committed the exact same fatal error when looking at their newly appointed chief executive. They saw the impeccable tailored suits, the Ivy League credentials mounted on mahogany office walls, the surgically practiced confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades inside the upper chambers of American corporate power, and they saw salvation. They saw the man who would drag their struggling, wounded company back from the edge of irrelevance and catapult it into a new era of unprecedented dominance. They saw a visionary. They saw a builder. They saw a titan. They were catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, because underneath that immaculate, carefully curated facade of executive competence lay something altogether different and infinitely more dangerous. A man operating not with the patient, strategic intelligence of a true builder, but with the cold, calculating precision of a professional extractor. A predator dressed in the language of leadership, armed with a compensation structure so aggressively fortified against failure that his personal financial outcome was completely, mathematically decoupled from the fate of the institution he had been hired to protect. The collapse of the company's stock price by 73% over 5 consecutive years. The liquidation of over 40,000 jobs across 8 different countries, executed not as a painful necessity, but as an aggressive cost-cutting performance designed to temporarily flatter the quarterly earnings numbers long enough to trigger the performance metrics embedded in his compensation plan. The catastrophic, humiliating destruction of $6 billion in shareholder equity, the abandonment of 3 crucial, market-defining research and development programs that competitors immediately seized and monetized into billion-dollar product lines. These were not strategic mistakes. They were systematic, methodical acts of institutional deconstruction. He did not build, he extracted, he did not lead, he cannibalized, and when the last viable organ of the corporate body had been thoroughly consumed, he collected the golden parachute, signed the separation agreement, and walked out the front door with $400 million in total compensation, while 40,000 families packed their desk belongings into cardboard boxes. Any other publicly traded corporation watching this slow-motion catastrophe unfold should have ejected him forcefully, long before the devastation reached its terminal stage. Any other board of directors possessing even a minimal threshold of fiduciary responsibility would have recognized the pattern, halted the destruction, and saved billions in shareholder value before the irreversible decisions compounded into a death sentence. The warning signs were not subtle. They were blazing, screaming, undeniable. They were visible in the disastrous acquisition he championed without adequate due diligence, the one that immediately saddled the company with $2.8 billion in goodwill impairment charges. They were visible in the catastrophic restructuring plan that gutted the engineering and product development divisions at the precise moment the competitive landscape demanded maximum innovation investment. They were visible in the engineering exodus when over 300 of the company's most critical technical minds resigned in a single 18-month window, fleeing the suffocating culture of financial engineering over actual engineering. But instead of intervening, the board doubled down. They renewed his contract. They approved the supplemental compensation packages. They publicly defended their chief executive with the desperate, theatrical conviction of men who knew that admitting the mistake would expose the depth of their own catastrophic negligence in hiring him. This is the story of how a single chief executive dismantled a once thriving industrial empire, turned the sacred fiduciary duty of corporate leadership into a ruthless personal wealth extraction machine, and learned how to financially profit from failure at a scale that made the company's actual survivors weep with impotent, helpless rage. To understand the sheer, absolute depth of this institutional betrayal, we must rewind time far back to the origins of both the man and the company he eventually inherited. The public relations myth surrounding this executive is polished and impeccable. A self-made professional, forged in the demanding crucible of corporate turnarounds, a man who had spent decades in the trenches of difficult restructuring processes, who understood intimately the mechanics of extracting efficiency from bloated, underperforming organizations. The company itself carried an equally romantic founding mythology, built by a passionate engineer in a modest workshop, scaled through decades of relentless innovation, and transformed into a market leader through the compounding force of genuine product excellence. Both myths are profound, monumental historical illusions. The man's prior record at previous companies revealed a consistent, recognizable pattern: short-term financial metric optimization, achieved by methodically dismantling long-term capability investments. The company's internal culture, beneath the polished exterior of its marketing materials, was already fracturing under the weight of a prior decade of misaligned incentives, bloated management layers, and a structural inability to make decisive investment decisions in the face of rapid technological disruption. The stage was not just set for failure, it was architecturally constructed for it. His ultimate weapon was something entirely invisible: the weaponization of his own employment contract. While the board and the shareholders fixated obsessively on the quarterly earnings narrative this man was spinning with such theatrical skill, he had quietly negotiated one of the most aggressively fortified compensation structures in the history of American corporate governance. While mortal employees had their financial futures entirely tied to the performance of the company's stock, this entity had engineered a personal financial architecture that was practically immune to corporate failure. His base salary was enormous. His annual bonus was structured against short-term EBITDA metrics that could be manipulated through selective asset sales and aggressive accounting choices. His equity compensation vested on a schedule so accelerated that the majority of his stock awards became permanently his before any of his most catastrophic strategic decisions produced their full, devastating consequences. And embedded within his contract was a separation clause of almost psychopathic generosity, a guaranteed termination package worth tens of millions of dollars, payable in full regardless of the specific circumstances of his departure, shielded from clawback provisions by layers of legal language that the board's own legal team had failed to fully comprehend before signing. He had not signed an employment contract. He had signed a guaranteed extraction vehicle, with the company itself as the commodity being consumed. And the consumption produced, for him personally, an absolutely staggering golden era. While the company bled, he accumulated. His total annual compensation during the years of maximum destruction ranged between $60 and $80 million per year. He sold massive blocks of his vested company stock at elevated prices during periods when his public statements about the company's trajectory were aggressively, demonstrably optimistic. He collected performance bonuses by meeting the exact short-term metrics he had personally designed, metrics specifically constructed to obscure the accelerating deterioration of the company's long-term competitive position. He presided over grandiose, expensive corporate retreats, maintained a corporate jet fleet of extraordinary indulgence and accepted a lifestyle of absolute, unquestioned luxury, while simultaneously executing layoffs on a scale that devastated entire communities built around the company's manufacturing facilities. The board applauded. The analyst community, seduced by the short-term earnings beats, maintained their buy ratings. The stock held its artificially inflated position just long enough for the most critical compensation events to complete. The hubris of his position was absolutely intoxicating. But the higher the artificial, manufactured ascent, the more devastating the inevitable, catastrophic collapse. And the collapse was agonizing, humiliating, and devastating to every single stakeholder except the one individual most responsible for engineering it. The corporate apocalypse arrived precisely when it was mathematically inevitable. The moment the short-term accounting maneuvers were exhausted, the moment the last viable business unit had been sold to fund the facade of operational health, and the moment the competitive landscape had so thoroughly absorbed the advantages surrendered by the company's gutted research and development division, that there was no viable path back to relevance. The stock entered a terminal spiral. Revenue missed estimates by catastrophic margins for 5 consecutive quarters. The credit rating agencies downgraded the company's debt to junk status in a single humiliating afternoon. Institutional shareholders, who had remained loyal to the narrative for years, executed a simultaneous, coordinated exit that collapsed the share price by 40% in a single trading session. And then came the most nauseating, infuriating revelation. In the final weeks of his tenure, as the company was announcing mass layoffs and warning of potential covenant violations with its lenders, this individual had quietly executed the final vesting event in his compensation plan, collecting the last tranche of his equity award before the stock entered its final, irreversible descent. It was not incompetence. It was not misfortune. It was the last, perfectly timed mechanical function of a compensation extraction vehicle operating exactly as designed. Yet, here lies the grand corporate plot twist. The story did not end with a criminal indictment, a securities fraud conviction, or even a meaningful regulatory penalty. Investigations were opened and quietly closed. Lawsuits from shareholder groups were settled for sums that represented a small fraction of the wealth extracted, with the legal fees themselves consuming the majority of the settlement proceeds. His legal team produced thousands of pages of board meeting minutes and email communications that demonstrated irrefutably that every single catastrophic decision had been explicitly authorized by the very board members now seeking to hold him accountable. He had documented every approval. He had created an absolute paper fortress of institutional complicity. The board could not destroy him without first destroying themselves, and so the most significant act of accountability they managed to produce was a press release describing his departure as a mutual decision reached after a productive period of leadership. He literally digested the institutional panic of his own accusers, using the documented record of their own eager complicity to neutralize every threat and preserve every dollar of his accumulated fortune. Fast forward to the modern era, and this story is no longer a singular scandal. It has been quietly recognized as a structural feature, not a malfunction, of the American executive compensation ecosystem. Governance reform advocates, shareholder rights organizations, and congressional investigators have spent years attempting to construct regulatory frameworks that would claw back compensation from executives whose decisions demonstrably destroyed corporate value. The Securities and Exchange Commission has introduced mandatory clawback rules. Proxy advisory firms have adopted more aggressive stances against excessive separation packages. Yet, the fundamental architecture remains intact. Compensation committees composed of interlocking board members who serve on each other's boards continue to approve packages that prioritize executive personal financial security over corporate health. The executives who destroyed companies continue to sit on advisory boards, collect consulting fees from the private equity firms that purchase the distressed assets of their former empires, and mentor the next generation of professional extractors in the quiet, well-appointed conference rooms of their personal family offices. This was not just a failure of governance. It was a profound, aggressive statement to every employee, every shareholder, and every regulator. We have engineered the system so completely in our favor that accountability is not a threat we are required to take seriously. They forged the ultimate personal mechanism for institutionalized, consequence-free destruction, a single, perfectly engineered human extraction instrument that enters an institution, accelerates its internal contradictions, harvests every available dollar on a pre-designed timeline, and exits before the terminal phase becomes undeniable. We are left staring at two entirely irreconcilable visions of this phenomenon. On one hand, it represents the most morally catastrophic expression of unchecked corporate governance failure, the absolute, undeniable proof that the executive class has engineered an entirely separate set of economic rules for itself, a world in which failure is rewarded, accountability is optional, and the financial destruction of tens of thousands of working people is not a tragedy, but simply a transaction. On the other hand, it is the perfectly honest, perfectly consistent, perfectly logical expression of a capitalist system that rewards the maximization of personal financial outcomes above all other considerations, a system that created the incentive structures, approved the compensation packages, and cheered the quarterly earnings beats long before it had the audacity to feign outrage at the results. Because sometimes, hidden behind the gleaming glass facade of a corporate headquarters now occupied by the liquidator counting the remaining assets, there is a quiet, invisible war. A war between the institution they were hired to protect, the personal fortune they were determined to extract, and the devastating, uncomfortable truth that in this particular war, only one side was ever truly fighting to win.